You know what's strange? Everyone's obsessed with talking about Gen Z like they're either the saviors of the planet or the most fragile generation that ever existed. And somehow, both of those things get said in the same breath, often by the same people. Born between 1997 and 2012, Gen Z is the first generation to have grown up with the internet, not as something you discovered, but as something that was just always there, like oxygen. And that changes everything about how their brains developed. But here's what nobody really gets right about them. The conversation always stops at phones, TikTok, and avocado toast. Wait, that's millennials. For Gen Z, it's more like phone addiction, mental health crises, and cancel culture. And sure, those things are real, but they're symptoms, not explanations. So let's actually get into the psychology.
First, you have to understand what it means to grow up as a digital native, not someone who adapted to the internet, but someone who never knew a world without it. Psychologists call this an environmental baseline shift. The world you're born into becomes your cognitive default. For Gen Z, constant connectivity, infinite information, and on-demand everything isn't a novelty, it's just reality, which sounds fine until you realize what that does to the developing brain. Research on attention and cognitive load suggests that the human brain isn't actually built for the kind of constant information switching that smartphones demand. A study out of the University of California found that the average attention switch happens every 47 seconds when working on a screen. For Gen Z, who has been doing this since childhood, the implications for sustained focus are still being studied. But what we do know is that their brains have been shaped by an environment that rewards fast processing and constant novelty in ways no previous generation has experienced.
And then there's social media. Not social media the way millennials got it, in their teens and early 20s, when their identities were mostly already forming. Gen Z got it young, much young. Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube. These weren't things they signed up for when they were old enough. They were woven into childhood. Researchers at the Gene Twenge Lab, the same psychologist who studied millennial narcissists, found a sharp rise in depression, anxiety, and loneliness among teenagers that correlates almost precisely with the widespread adoption of smartphones around 2012. Gen Z was right in the middle of that. Here's the psychological mechanism that makes this particularly complicated. Adolescence is already the most identity-sensitive period of human development. Your brain is literally rewiring itself, pruning connections, figuring out who you are and where you fit. Erik Erikson called this the identity versus role confusion stage. Now imagine going through that process while also managing a public-facing profile where your worth is measured in likes, follower counts, and whether you said the right thing at the right time. That's not just pressure. That's a fundamentally different developmental environment than any previous generation has navigated.
In the comparison trap goes deeper than anyone talks about. Previous generations compared themselves to their immediate social circle, maybe a few dozen people. Gen Z compares themselves to curated highlight reels from millions. Social comparison theory, developed by psychologist Leon Festinger, tells us that humans naturally evaluate themselves against others, but the theory was built around local, bounded social groups. Nobody accounted for what happens when the comparison pool becomes essentially infinite and algorithmically optimized to show you the most aspirational content possible. But here's where it gets really interesting, because Gen Z's response to all of this is genuinely unprecedented. Rather than pretending the pressure doesn't exist, they named it. They built an entire vocabulary around mental health, boundaries, trauma responses, anxiety, and burnout before many of them were even old enough to drive. The destigmatization of therapy that millennials started, Gen Z accelerated to a degree that no previous generation would recognize. And that's not weakness. Psychologically speaking, that's actually a sophisticated coping response. Naming something is the first step to regulating it.
But there's a paradox here. Gen Z is the most mentally health-aware generation in history, and also one of the most mentally unwell. CDC data from 2023 showed that more than 40% of high school students reported persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. That's not a trivial statistic. That's a public health crisis wearing a generation's face. And the cruel irony is that they have all the language to describe what's happening to them, and relatively few of the systemic resources to actually fix it. Let's talk about
about something that almost never gets discussed in the right way. Gen Z grew up under a weight of collective existential threats that is genuinely historically unusual. Climate change wasn't an abstract future problem for them the way it was for millennials. It was a present, documented, measurable crisis they inherited. School shootings weren't rare, shocking events. They were something you did active shooter drills for, the way earlier generations did fire drills. A global pandemic shut down their formative social years. These aren't background stressors. These are foreground realities that shaped how an entire generation relates to the future.
Psychologists who study what's called future orientation, basically how optimistically or pessimistically you imagine your own future, have found that Gen Z shows patterns of what some researchers are calling anticipatory grief. They're mourning futures they're not sure they'll get to have. That's a cognitive posture that has real consequences for motivation, risk-taking, and long-term planning. And yet, and this is the part that genuinely surprises people who haven't been paying attention, Gen Z is also the most entrepreneurial, most socially mobilized, most pragmatically idealistic generation researchers have measured. They don't trust institutions, not because they're cynical for no reason, but because they watched institutions fail on a spectacular scale during their entire childhood. Financial systems, political systems, healthcare systems, social media platforms, none of them delivered what they promised. So Gen Z largely decided to build their own structures, side hustles, creator economies, mutual aid networks, grassroots organizing. They're not waiting for systems to fix themselves. They're building workarounds.
All right, so gather round close. This one's a bit spook. It was last summer, just over that ridge. A group, just like us, you know? They heard it first. A sort of scraping sound, slow, real slow from deep in the trees. And then the whispering started. Couldn't make out words, just sibilant-like. One of them, he pointed his flashlight out there towards the sound. Nothing, just blackness. But the whisper, it got louder, almost personal, you know. He swore he saw eyes, just for a second, reflecting the beam back, low to the ground, too low. They packed up fast, real fast, didn't even douse the fire properly, just ran. And the whole time, that scraping, that whisper, it seemed to be following them. So, if you hear anything tonight, maybe, just maybe, keep your flashlights off.
And then there's loneliness, which is almost absurd to say about the most connected generation in history. But the data is consistent. Despite having more digital social contact than any previous generation, Gen Z reports higher rates of loneliness. The Surgeon General of the United States issued an advisory on this. The distinction that psychologists draw is between connection and genuine intimacy. Having 800 followers is not the same as having someone who will sit with you when things fall apart. Gen Z knows this, maybe more acutely than anyone, because they've watched the performance of connection their entire lives. So what you've got is a generation that is simultaneously the most informed, most stressed, most therapeutically literate, most entrepreneurially minded, most politically engaged, and most acutely lonely cohort that researchers have ever measured. They didn't choose these contradictions. They were handed them by the world they were born into. The easy take is to call them fragile, or lost, or addicted to their phones. The more accurate take is that they're navigating a set of conditions that are genuinely new in human history, with developing brains, limited institutional support, and a level of self-awareness about their own struggles that previous generations would have found uncomfortable. Whether that combination produces resilience or collapse, nobody actually knows yet. The oldest Gen Z members are only in their late 20s. The story isn't finished, but what seems clear is that understanding their psychology requires setting aside the stereotypes and actually looking at the environment that built them. Because in the end, generations don't create themselves, the world does. If this resonated with you, please subscribe. And if you want to support these deep dives, hit that join button to become a channel member. I would genuinely appreciate your support.